and it's geared towards youth and student movement, trying to have an engagement series that we allow the movement to get a sense of what youth and students are thinking, experiencing, and demanding when it comes to their future. So we welcome you once again to this platform, and we ask you to please let us know where you are joining us via the chat box, and we're going to start this meeting in the next 3 minutes. So thank you very much once again. I would sincerely appreciate you for your time. So let us know your name, the country where you are joining us, and you can join this conversation as well on across social media by tweeting or posting with the hashtag reclaiming our education agenda. Once again, I welcome you to this August event. Thank you.
Thank you, Abidine. My name is Ashanti Kunene. I am the Advocacy and Research Officer here at the GCE. I am going to be co-moderating this event with Abidine, our esteemed colleague. Thank you so much for taking the time to join our discussion today on the economics of education. Before we get started, I'll invite my colleague Christina to please play the youth video that will provide some context for our discussion today.
That the government has since maybe make it a DNA or part of their habit to arrest young people who are fighting or trying to break the buccal cavities of oppression. But they will never stop. They will never be afraid. They will always fight on, just like myself.
Hi, my name is Papa Maccabi and I'm an inventor and activist. So it's super important for us to feel represented in the curriculum and to start shaping the future of education. Yet, it's very hard for young individuals to reclaim the educational sector and start shaping the curriculums that are taught in school. So instead, we started educating each other through social media by creating fun infographics and fun posts that everyone can read and has access to. By that, we're learning information from each other and hearing other people's experiences and making sure everyone is seen and heard. And because it's so special to be able to share your own story and have other people relate to it. And that's what you get when you have young individuals on social media. So although we're not able to share the curriculums, we still found ways to teach each other because education is not limited only to classrooms.
My name is Lala Toure, a 23-year-old Gambian political science student at the University of the Gambia. I am currently the Gambian representative to the Commonwealth Youth Council and equally an alumni of Faragam Gambian chapter. There is a dire need for governments to prioritize education financing during the formulation, planning, and implementation stages of all state annual budgets. There is also a need for states to intensify efforts to ensure periodic assessments of priority education needs within every fiscal year. These assessments will basically ensure the government has access to accurate and timely data to identify key areas of intervention within the educational system on an annual basis. All of this will ensure an enhanced educational system and will also ensure people have life-changing experiences with education, giving them the chance to subsequently contribute to the vibrant socioeconomic and political development of their various nations.
My name is Mary Jacob Ogusa, the GPE leader hosted by Guys Transform Education. I'm Nigerian and I live in Nigeria. I was once told that leadership is making changes and making efforts that outlive even your own life. Stay leaders. Make the efforts to prioritize education today, as education is the bedrock for every other developmental changes you can make.
Bonjour à tous, je suis Geneviève Wadjoun,
enseignante syndicaliste camerounaise vivant dans la région du littoral du Cameroun. J'y enseigne depuis 5 ans et je suis de la Fédération camerounaise des syndicats de l'éducation, en abrégé FECAS. Le plus grand challenge concernant le financement de l'éducation pour moi se résumerait en ramener l'État à refinancer le secteur de l'éducation parce que l'État finance de moins en moins le secteur de l'éducation, cela en laissant par exemple des individuels investir le secteur de l'éducation en créant des instituts. Parce que qui dit privatisation dit exclusion. Une certaine tranche de la population ne pourra pas avoir accès. Si un établissement a des frais très chers, une famille moins nantie ou des familles qui n'ont pas suffisamment des revenus ne pourront pas avoir des frais.
We are reclaiming our education agenda for ourselves within our lifetime.
We are reclaiming our educational agenda ourselves in our lifetime.
Power shift.
Because education shifts power. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I hope what you have heard is giving you some energy to engage with us today. We are here to talk about the economics of education, global education financing, and how that impacts our basics to education as young people. I'm really excited to be here and to engage with you all about what I personally feel incredibly passionate about. So right now, it's the World Bank and IMF annual meetings. And apparently, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is a cause for concern for the presidents of these global financial institutions, as it should be. However, nowhere in the engagement and conversations I've tuned into is there an understanding of how this inequality has come to be. And so global leadership is trying to solve a problem they cannot name. Nowhere is there an acknowledgement of the role of global history in creating a white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, neocolonial, capitalist modern world where money is much more important than human life, where you're able to do anything is dependent on having money. Gaining an education being the most problematic example of this, where the purpose of education is positioned so it create human capital as opposed to the human. Now, in the pandemic context of COVID-19, where you see the preference of our governments for public-private partnerships before meaningful collaborations with civil society and civil society organizations to overcome the digital divide and sustainable post-pandemic education systems. So the conversation we are going to have today is incredibly important because this narrative of education for human capital needs to be interrupted with radical intention. We're going to talk about the economic education with radical intention, and I hope you're all as excited as I am. So in today's run of show, we have some amazing speakers who my co-moderator will introduce to us shortly. We will then cite the Action Aid, Democratizing Global Governance and Multilateral report, which speaks the need for us as young people to be much more vigilant with regards to the decisions taken about us, for us at the global level. We will then
You are muted, Ashanti.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So as I was saying, we'll move on to then the panel discussion around the education financing system, how it works, particularly in Africa, given our history of economic extraction, what the gaps and those are, and what taking transformative and feminist lens to education financing means, and how we can use research to push a revolutionary agenda. I will then come on to provide a brief introduction to the GCE's Education Financing Observatory as a structure that young people can plug into and leverage in order to keep governments accountable to their education financing commitments and help co-create future education systems. Following this, my co-moderator will lead us in a Jamboard ideation session where you will tell us how the students who can best lead, engage, participate, employ strategies and tactics to push youth advanced work and promote youth engagement in education financing decisions at all levels. This feedback is important because your inputs here will ultimately inform the GCE's global youth strategy that my colleague Zena is leading on as a engagement officer. So once we've wrapped up that final session, remarks from our speakers, and that is our run of show today. And without further ado, I will hand over to my co-moderator, Abdi.
All right, thank you very much, Asante. That was well detailed, and I sincerely appreciate you for the context setting. Once again, participants, want to thank you all, especially those who are featured in the video and sharing insights and clear recommendations. Want to assure you that this has helped us to further frame our conversation today. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our conversationist today. We've got an array of experts that will share their experiences across different sectors where they work. So I would like to introduce Taibat Hussein. Taibat Hussein is a development economics and education for all advocates from Nigeria. So Taibat, kindly please unmute and say hi to our participants.
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here today. I look forward to insightful conversations. Thank you. All
right, thank you very much. We were supposed to have Tapi Wanache. He's having a little bit of network challenge, so very soon is going to be joining us. Is the Secretary General of Sinazu from Zimbabwe. I move over to Alexandra Sebal from Obesu. Alexandra, please, can you unmute and say hi to our participants?
Hello, everyone. First of all, let me thank you for the invitation and to be part of the session today. And I also wanted to say that I feel very inspired by the video and your words.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Alexandra. I move to Eleanor Joyce from Asbe from the Philippines. Hi, Eleanor. Okay. I guess Elena is having a little bit of challenge. So I move over to Jibril Ahmed Hassan from Somalia Coalition for Education. Jibril, please, can you unmute and say hi to our participants?
Hi, everyone. And I'm Jibril Ahmed Hassan from FSOM, Education Coalition for All Somalis, and member of Youth Office of AKIA. And glad to be here today with you. We will look forward together.
Yeah, thank you very much as well, Jibril. We are excited to have you. Last but not least on the agenda is Collins. Collins is a Global Youth Advisor, Action Aid International. He's from Kenya, but based in Tanzania. We're excited to have you, Collins.
Hi, everyone. My name is Collins. I work for Action Aid as a Global Youth Engagement Advisor. I look forward to quite a good conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Collins. So like I said the other time, I'm excited to announce that we now have Tapi Wanache joining us, the Secretary General Sinazu Zimbabwe. Tapi Wanache, you want to unmute?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I have to turn on my video, my network will probably give us problems, so I will join via audio most of the time. But I am Tapi Wanache Chiriga, and I am from Zimbabwe, and I serve as the Secretary General of the Zimbabwe National Students Union, ZINASU.
Thank you very much, Tapi Wanache. We are excited to have you there. So next, I move on to Collins Odiabo, who is the Global Youth Advisor for Action Aid. It will be spotlighting the AI reports. Over to you, Collins.
Thanks a lot. Let me just see if I can share my screen very quickly. Can you see my screen?
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks a lot. Again, really thank you for it's really exciting to be part of this conversation. I have around 10 minutes just to really deep dive a little bit into the report that Action Aid has just that we released, and it's mostly looking at the economic forces behind the different crises. I think that we currently the world is currently going through, but also at the same time it has some really great recommendations. And after that I will definitely share the link to this report so that you can also read it. But very quickly, sorry. Great. So, we are having a very good conversation, but also in the midst of the pandemic that the world is currently going through. And what the report looks at is some of the structural causes, but also what really drives forces, not just behind COVID, but also looking at gender responsive public services. And then what the report is actually talking about is the financing part. And that this is what this conversation is all about. So the Who Cares for the Future report was done by ActionAid with lots of our allies from all over the world. It's a very extensive new research, and I would really ask you to look at it after this conversation. And what the report highlights, or what it looks at, it's, for example, it dissects IMF programs, but also looking at the policy advice and how that then affects public services. Education being one of the most important public services. I think that we have in all our countries. It both looks at it from all low, but also many middle income countries. But also at the same time is also looking at the crisis that we are all going through, the debt crisis, and how that how that impacts again the public spending on most of our public services. But also at the same time, it also looking at the different tax reforms that most of our countries, whether in the low or middle income countries, have. But then it also looks at the trends when it comes to public spending. So how much are we actually putting into education? How much are we putting into into health? How much is actually going into water and sanitation, and all those things? And this report has very many findings, but I'll just highlight some that are relevant for this conversation. And what actually the report looks at, it's also looking at the links that are there. Because if you look at, there are really clear obligations on all our governments, all states, and this of course has also been agreed in international law, to deliver on the human rights, right, to education, health, water, and to do so in many ways that actually eliminates direct or indirect discrimination, right? In order to really make substantive equality a reality. And the provision of quality public services is key to delivering on these obligations. And doing so can actually make a huge impact when it comes to the burden that different sections of our society really face. So the report seeks to really fill a gap, because what we are looking at is that it seeks to flesh out which public services will be most transformative for reducing, unpaid care work, again, looking at the care economy, notably for women in the global south, but also just to show how chronically underfunded these services, and education being one of them, is, of course, to respond both to present, but also future needs. And then what it then does is that it offers practical solutions to achieve this dramatic change when it comes to financing of public services, which, for example, includes, as I've just mentioned, how action on debt is essential to securing additional financing for most of our public services, education being a very important service, but also how the IMF policies and conditions really need to change in line with the institutions rhetoric on gender inequality, but also to allow countries to invest in public services. And then, of course, how countries can then expand their domestic tax revenue when it comes to gender responsive and progressive ways, and how, of course, that investment in gender responsive public services, which as ActionAid education is definitely such an important and very crucial when it comes to redistributing unpaid care work and domestic work, and of course generating decent work opportunities. So on average, what we've actually found is that on average, from our report, an average woman spent around 4 hours and 25 minutes doing unpaid care work, and of course compared to men's average 1 hour and 23 minutes, and of course this is changing every time, and if properly valued, this would actually constitute at least 9% of our global GDP, or a whooping US dollars 11 trillion. And what this whole report talks about, guys, is that there is need for us to reframe the economy, right? The provision of gender responsive public services is really key to deliver human rights, but also to transform women's life, right? Childcare, public education, health, water, all this is really crucial if we ever going to, if we're really going to deliver on human rights and the need to transform, of course, as actually, women's lives is really important. And what the We Care, the Who Cares report, one of the key findings is that if you look at, across all over the world, the different public services have really been chronically underfunded for decades. And this has left very many countries unable to deliver on people's rights, which is really way off, target for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, but also unable to respond effectively to COVID. So one of the things that really need to be looked at, or that the report really needs looks at quite heavily, is the need to reframe the economy. Unpaid care work is not really factored into calculations of most of our GDPs across the world. And this actually reveals that GDP is a very limited measure, of course, of an economy. And this is because if you look at most of our economic theories, they really look narrowly at capital and markets, really focusing on paid work rather than the vast arena of unpaid care and domestic work. And of course, ignoring the intrinsic value of care. And of course, this makes really women and their contribution largely invisible when it comes to the economy. And of course, this ignores much of the foundation of human survival. And then of course, as we all know, one central part of such reframing the economy is really to look at the case for investment in quality, gender responsive public services. And this is increasingly being undermined, of course, we are really in a neoliberal worldview that really doubts the impotence of universal public provision by the states. Of course, quality education, right? If you look at for education, health, access to clean water, sanitation are really fundamental rights in themselves. So universal provision of these public services is really essentially a justice issue, which should really require no further justification. But of course, despite this compelling human rights framework, some of them that we all know, such as the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights and Political Commitment, such as, for example, SDGs, many core public services, education, is really have been, but also still remain chronically underfunded, especially in countries in the global south. So looking at education as an essential services through the lens of the connection between, as I've said, gender responsive public services and the care economy, the unpaid care, can really add renewed momentum to the case for substantial new investment. But it can also help to make the case that recurrent costs that goes into education and many of our basic services should really be protected even at times of austerity. So of course, this is also another key finding. If you look at it, vis-a-vis the pandemic that has actually hit the world, you actually see that women and girls are really hardest hit. If you look at, for example, the school closures that many of the countries have actually gone through for the last one year, the school closures actually mean, if you look at it, it means that more women are actually caring for children at home, right? Also, if you look at the informal economy, the majority of them are still women. Most girls in many of our countries in the global south are still responsible for collecting work, but without access to, so again, just looking at gender responsive public services more widely. It's about focus. It focuses on financing, and if you look at financing against debts, many countries right now, despite the fact that they are really well established international benchmarks when it comes to spending on education, most of our governments, through this report, it actually shows that government, as we know, which should spend between 4 to 6% of their GDP on education, and at least, right, allocate at least 15 to 20% of public expenditure to education. This is not happening. Countries are presently falling short from this, with low-income countries, of course, presently spending, an average of 14.8% only on education. And of course, some of the countries with the biggest education challenges from this report, you'll see that's like Nigeria, for example, and Pakistan. They're spending less than 10% of their national budgets on education, right? And even countries that spends a fair share of their national budgets on education, they still lack resources, especially where the tax to the GDP ratio is so low. That overall government revenue then becomes so insufficient, right? And just from the report, if you look at the amounts of money that most of our countries are actually spending, if you look at public services vis-a-vis servicing debts, we're actually seeing that more and more countries are actually spending more on servicing debts than actually the amounts of money that goes into education. Into education, and thanks a lot, into education and many other public services. So the report also focuses on and also has some very good recommendations, focusing on financing, but mostly on debt. So the whole report, as I finish, it's really focusing on austerity. Again, just looking again the role that IMF holds vis-a-vis the public spendings that goes into education and other public services. So what we've actually found is that IMF has been imposing unnecessarily low inflation targets in 80% of the countries that this report that has data that this report focuses on. It also imposes really low deficit targets. Again, in the report, 96% of countries. There's also an aspect of freezing or cutting of public sector wage bills. Again, 17% of. So most governments, what this then means is that these austerity measures that most governments have been forced to undertake means that they cannot employ, for example, more teachers. There cannot be more doctors, nurses, or care workers. So what we're actually saying is that governments really needs to resist the ideology of austerity, the neoliberal economics that the world is currently going through, and really invest urgently in public services. Especially if you look in many of our countries, especially global south, most schools don't even have enough teachers, right? And then again, of course, focusing on financing. How can countries then expand their tax base to GDP ratios, and then how much of that really needs to go into gender responsive public services, like education. So in conclusions, what this report really combines is that it combines actions on debt, tax, but at the same time looking at austerity, and of course and how that enables a sea change of investment when it comes to gender responsive public services, which education is one of them. And then, of course, the need for dramatic scaling up of spending on gender responsive public services. If we do this, then this could actually save really women from across the world around 9 billion hours every day. And of course, then the last one is really around the need for a new, as I've mentioned, the new need to have a new economics, one that does not just measure progress by GDP growth, and really ignoring planetary boundaries and really making women's and paid work invisible. Yeah, so this is what this report looks at. I'll just, if you get time, please really deep
dive. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Collins. That was a well-detailed report. And kudos to Action Aid International and other colleagues who really worked on this in-depth research. So like I said on the chat box, please, if you have any question on this brief presentation of research, you can show by raising up your hand or you use the chat box. While we wait for others to, ask questions, I've got a few questions for you here, Collins. And the first question reads, while you're making presentation, you mentioned the need to reframe the economy, especially, the power imbalances in the decision-making at the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank are historical, and there's limited acknowledgement of the history. So how can we change this? What can we do to reframe and change the economy, but not repeat past mistake? Once again, I might take the question. You mentioned the need to reframe the economy. The power imbalances in decision-making at the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and the World Bank are historical, and there's limited acknowledgement of the history. So the question is, how can we change this? And what can we do to reframe and change the economy, but not repeat past mistake?
Thanks a lot. If you look at our economy, the way it is right now, it still doesn't factor a lot of things. We're still looking at, we still factor, for example, the care economy and paid care work is really not factored when it comes to calculation of GDP. And what this has actually revealed is that GDP is a very limited measure of an economy. So if you're only using GDP to look at the economy, then we are not really looking at the different dimensions to the measurement and they need to have that multidimensional framework for measuring, for example, living standards, but also at the same time, well-being. Feminist economists, have actually argued that care rather than capital should really be at the center when it comes to our concerns. So again, looking at public services, we really need to rather than looking at it with capital lenses, but actually, they argue that we need to look at care, which should be at the center of our concerns, because care for both people and the planet is really key when it comes to the sustainability of life, to what we should really, truly value. And again, as I mentioned, if you look at most economic theories, they really look narrowly at capital and markets, really focusing on paid work, rather than really the vast arena of unpaid care, domestic work, and really ignoring that intrinsic value of care. And you know what this has meant? That it has made women contribution to the economy largely invisible, and really ignores much of the foundation of human survival, especially with when it's with increasing care dependency ratios. So what we need to do, as you've asked, is really an urgent need to rethink economics, to fully integrate the meaning and importance of care work, but also reshape our social frameworks accordingly. And one central part of such a reframing is really to look again at the case for investment when it comes to quality, gender responsive public services. And the reason why this has not been happening is because increasingly, we're being undermined by, what I like calling a neoliberal worldview that really doubts the importance of universal public provision by states or by governments. And on gender responsive public services, what we mean is that it's around a common framework for GRPS, so gender responsive public services, that really looks at public services that are publicly funded. So this means, for example, if you're looking at education, we have to ask ourselves, is how much actually goes into education? Right? Is there a fair share of budgets that goes to education?
Yeah.
If it's going to education, it's going to which sectors, right? Because with a good size of overall budget, which is what I like calling a progressive tax base, again, looking at that from a macroeconomic policies, there needs to also, that needs to go hand in hand with also being, having sensitivity of budget.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
So, yeah.
So I think what you're trying to say, it will really be delve into properly during our panel session. So that takes me to another question as well, Collins. Key takeaway from your response: we rethink the economy, we reframe it, the agenda, and we make a case for investment. That was spot on. So the next question for you is the tax to GDP ratio, the domestic resource mobilization, and issue of tax justice. From your own perspective, in what way can young people take up this issue?
I think there's really there are different angles to look at it. If you look at, for example, I think the crisis that the world is going through. If you look at debts, we've just looked at debts financing, for example. If more and more countries are spending money servicing debts than actually going into key public services, for example, education, who does that impact the most? It actually impacts us as young people, right? What that means, if less and less is going to education, it means that the services that we are actually getting in education, it might be accessible, but maybe it's not available. It might be available, but maybe it's not safe, right? So what that means is that it's young people that are actually really at the center of this, and this is why when it comes to issues around taxes, but also just being aware about what allocation goes where, it's really young people who are really at the center of all this. And as I've already acknowledged, the new debt also crisis is really more complex than the one that started in many years ago. So if you read, for example, the 1970s, what we are currently going through, it's actually more complex than what happened in 70s, and attention is being drawn, and young people really need to bring their attention to this, because statistics really points to the impact of this crisis and what really it means to the lives of young people. So not just education, but look at all the other public service. Look at, for example, health. Again, really young people are at the center of it. So it's young people who really needs to also, first of all, be aware, but also just ask some of these questions. Because since 2015 and 2019, if you look at government spending, for example, to education. For example, I've done a very good analysis on Kenya and Senegal, right? They present really clear cases of the level of government spending, which has really declined with each rise in debt, and vice versa. So if there are more debts, there's less that is actually going into education as a very important public service, and this continues to skyrocket.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. So I will pass over the mic to Ashanti to ask a question before we delve proper into the panel session. So Ashanti, you have a question?
I think for me, what comes up, especially now as you're making the point about debt, Collins, is to what extent is financial literacy important, right? So if we just bring it down to the individual level, I was a fully grown adult before I actually learned how money works and what debt is and credit cards and interest on credit cards and what, just the flow of money. Like, to what extent does that, help us, or is that necessary in being able to resolve this debt issue, not just at a national level, but also like on a personal level?
Over to you, Collins.
I don't think I had that, sorry. It's just my network. I think I lost you, Ashanti, for maybe a minute or something. I don't know if you just want to come in again. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I think let's just move on to then the panel discussion because we are at time now. So Aberdeen,
All right.
would like
Okay.
to
All
kick us
right.
off. Thank
you
you.
very much for that, Ashanti. We can always take that on the chat box. So, like I said as well, we are diving into the panel session now. So I want to introduce one of our panelists who was really having a little bit of network issue the other time. She's no other person than Eleanor Joyce from ASPE. Eleanor, please can you unmute and say hi to our participants? Eleanor.
Hi, good evening from the Philippines and good day to all of you. I'm sorry for the internet latency in our country.
No worries. Thank you.
It's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine. So thank you very much. So we are kickstarting a panel session also. Like I said all the time, we want you to engage with us, make contributions using the chat box, make contribution across social media with the hashtag Reclaim Education Agenda. So Tybert, the first question is, of course, you've listened to the presentation from Collins. You've heard about the perspective he shared about the report. So the question would be, how does the education financing system work? And where should money be going? Tybert, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think I should first say well done, Collins. That was a very insightful presentation, and I think it sums up most of what I'll be saying today. And when we talk about education financing, overall, we're talking about, the financial and the in-kind resources available for education. And the education financing system addresses questions about how resources are allocated, how they are being used and accounted for to achieve sustainable quality education for all. And finance for education is often made up of, we have the public funds, we have international aid and donor contributions, as well as private sector investments, such as companies, foundation, investors, and individual households. And the proportion, the amount of funding from each of the source depends on country context. However, domestic public spending is by far the most important source of finance for education, especially when we're talking about basic education. For example, here in Nigeria, basic education is financed through concurrent financing from the three tiers of government that we have, the federal, the state, and the local government. And they have distinct financing mandate as well as responsibility. The federal government often provides about 50%, while the state and local government 30% and 20% respectively. After government, the household are often the largest source of education financing. And recently, in response to the education financial crisis, some stakeholders have also called for more business investment in education markets. However, this is very tricky. Like I do say, it is important to highlight that education is a public good, and it is important that the social interest in education is not sacrificed for the sake of private profit. There's been a growing body of research that has shown that the reliance on the private sector has particularly negative effect on children from the poorest background. And it also undermines the legal obligation of states to adequately fund and also prioritize spending on free quality education for all. Recently, in a paper that I wrote, I also argued that, when you shift responsibility for, the shifting of responsibility for education from the Nigerian government and onto the private sector, apparently this has been happening since 1980s, has resulted in an education system that is ill-equipped to deal with any shocks. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic, and to mitigate the effects of this pandemic or any other pandemic on the existing inequalities in the education system, there is a need for us to increase public spending and state involvement rather than, the increasing over-reliance on the private sector. When we're talking about where should the money go, we know that despite the commitment to universal education, state spending, public spending on education is historically low in many countries in the global south. Using Nigeria as a reference, between 2010 and 2014, just about 0.8% of the federal budget was spent on education. And I think Collins mentioned this, that Nigeria is spending less than 10%, which is true. In the 2021 budgetary allocation to education sector, just about 5.8% was allocated. This insufficient, allocation of resources is particularly concerning, given that education has been widely recognized as a top development priority. And I think, like I do say, to achieve this goal of education for all, it is important for, African governments to provide a level of predictable and sustainable investment in education. Beyond the issue of, allocation of finance for education, no less important is also ensuring that these resources are actually used effectively by reducing the spending inefficiencies common in many education systems. For instance, in Nigeria, I keep saying Nigeria because I work here, most of my research is focused on Nigeria. A larger proportion of the education budget is spent on concurrent expenditure like personnel costs and overhead costs, and just about, let's say, 20% of for example, just about 20% of the 2021 education budget was allocated to capital items. These poses serious consequences for the education of millions of children, especially those from the poorest family. And one could easily argue that, the debt of capital expenditure worsened the impact of COVID-19 on school children. The existing inequalities in education was aggravated by the inequality in access to remote learning, notably for children from low-income households and for those in rural areas. As such, there is a need, for deliberate and intentional investment in the education sector, and money should be spent in areas that improve learning for all. I think public spending also should be allocated in ways that, do not exclude the poor and marginalized children. That is very key. Evidence from many countries shows that, public education expenditure can often favor the wealthy and more powerful groups. I think I should also point that it is important to ensure that the mix of input and interventions that are funded work together well. For example, more classrooms may be built, but there are insufficient funds to hire the teachers that need to use them. Equally, teachers are present in classrooms, but they lack the learning materials needed to teach effectively. As such, improving coherence is not just about, mixing of this input, but also about the system that manages this input.
But you might have to round up, please.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that was super awesome. We noticed we give opportunity to Taibat. Taibat is well prepared, giving us different analysis around the financing, the deficits, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, using case study of Nigeria. Of course, thank you very much for that well-detailed analysis. I'll pass over the mic again to Ashanti to ask the next panel the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abidin. So we're gonna maybe direct this question to Tapiwa Nashem. Hearing what Taiwan has just said and thinking about the global education financing system, how does it look in Africa? Especially for now, considering our history of economic extraction and oftentimes the co-option of our leadership into these global financial flows. How does this work, and how do we best change how this system works in Africa? Over to you, Tapiwa Nashem.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Audible, thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, maybe we need to classify, as others they say, that education is not just about affordability or maybe whether or not one can access it. It is a public good. It is more about social justice and fundamental human rights, and probably in many countries, constitutionalism and constitutionally allocated and given rights. So in Africa, we have a problem where, and even in some parts of the world beyond Africa, we have had a problem where governments fund wars that don't exist, more than they fund the education sector. We see that because of the political economy, the politics of Africa, we've seen strong men leaders, dictators, trying as much as possible as they could to fund their militaries more, to fund their police states more than they fund education, which in our view as the Zimbabwe National Students Union is probably the destruction of the future and the pillaging of the present. Why do we say so? Education in itself is the foundation and bedrock upon which the future, the dreams, the aspirations of any country that is self-respecting should be built. So in Africa, there are serious gaps, and they have been exposed particularly by the COVID-19 pandemic, where governments were not prepared to at least mitigate and embrace the disaster that came with the COVID-19 pandemic and the disruptions that came to the academic calendar of 2020, 2021. And thus we've seen serious inequalities where the poor, they have not been able to access education, they've not been able to afford education thanks to a number of reasons. And unfortunate poverty that is bedeviling at least 60% of our populations, particularly here, even in Zimbabwe. And you see, it is very sad that we've had international protocols, we've had the Dakar Declaration, we've had the Incheon Declaration, we've had the John TM Declaration. All of them have had clear guidelines as to how education should be financed and what percentage, what amount of money, what percentage of the economy, what percentage of the budget should be put into education. But that has since been ignored. Where I come from in Zimbabwe, the largest contribution that the budget has ever made to the education sector, and as far as the budgets are concerned, was 12% to both basic and tertiary education, which is very sad. But as to how things should be done, like I said before, we should see education as a public good, as a matter of social justice, as a matter of safeguarding the future and protecting the present. So we should make sure that all proceeds from corruption, all proceeds from illicit financial flows, if they are to be reclaimed by the state, should go towards financing education. Number one, that's number one. Number two, most of our taxes, most of our taxation should go towards the most important two services that any country can offer its citizens, which is health and education. Education about education. You see, in a country like where I come from, Zimbabwe, where the budget itself is very lean, and to allocate 13%, 12-13% in totality to basic elementary education, high and tertiary education is very unfair, and it is a sign that maybe we are not ready to embrace the future, to embrace what should the future look like. So it is our position that yes, in as much as we would like to avoid the privatization of our education systems, we equally should look forward to and maybe channel our resource mobilization towards public-private partnerships that should be the center of education financing as they start funding progressive expenses like research and infrastructure development in institutions. That can be done. I'm so sure that even big companies, we could avoid the capture of institutions, but we could equally make sure that these institutions and these corporates and these big private institutions can start funding research that could benefit both the institutions of learning and the student. And equally, these private entities. And like I said before, money in the 21st century should be channeled towards research and infrastructure. But most importantly, as we've seen, thanks to the disruption of our calendars and this new brand of learning, which they're calling online learning, which I don't agree, because it's just people getting onto a Zoom platform, snoring there and thinking that they're learning, but it is beyond the access and affordability of the young person out there. It is beyond the access and affordability of the young poor person out there in the raw areas, deep in the raw areas of Zimbabwe, deep into the raw areas of other underprivileged and marginalized communities. So it is time that now governments should start channeling resources towards building better technological infrastructure, building better even physical infrastructure, libraries, making sure that every student can access online in this new era of blended learning. So every student should be able to access at least a gadget that would enable them to learn. That can be done. So we maintain the position that the state should be the primary provider of education finance, and private-public partnerships should also come into play. And then Belena, itself, as we move towards free education, should, for now, at least when the budget is still constricted, should also make sure that they pay their tuition, but very access to education from young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tapio Nashi, for that input. I think drawing on your contribution, Eleanor, I'd like to call on you to speak to us from a transformative and feminist lens, right? How best should education financing be spent? Where should the money go? What should the focus of these investments really be if we're taking an intersectional look at all of these things? So if I can ask Eleanor to please come and engage. Eleanor?
Hi, good evening. I'm very sorry for the internet latency in our area, but to address the question, I would just like to start that the pandemic has revealed the crucial role of education, and it has to remain to be a public good, accessible to all and should be given of highest quality. And this is very evident in the Philippines a while ago. The internet latency in our area affected how I interact in this webinar, and it shows that we need a strong investment, not only in the Philippines, but in the countries all over the world to invest more on education, especially under the new normal. And with the prolonged school closures, there is an evident skyrocketing rate of school dropouts in most countries in South Asia that has revealed the systematic inequalities in terms to the access to education, especially for women who holds the short end of the stick. And this is due to the lack of technological support and digital devices, where women have limited access and abilities required to adapt to the modalities of virtual classes in the new normal. Also, the declining financial resources is a pandemic-induced consequence that have reduced the education opportunities. And to note, there is also a rising cases of harassment and domestic violence that is much more alarming among children and women under a new normal setup of education. And with this, it is important to recognize that prior to the pandemic, there is a wide gender gap when it comes to education opportunities, where women has been a vulnerable sector as gender equality remained elusive as time has progressed. Because for one, the global education system is deemed as a transmitting vehicular of patriarchal norms and values, and this is evident on textbooks that instills gender stereotypes, conventional gender roles, and even gender division in sports. And on a more deepened ideological perspective, the women are long enough portrayed under a false deficient feminine nature that justifies the oppression experienced by women in a class society even up to date, as the inferiority of womankind and the subordination of women to men in home and in society and in schools continued to be accustomed. This has affected the unequal access of women to education. Hence, given this context, education financing should be spent centering on developing a transformational education and a gender-sensitive system in the academe, alongside of the call for global academic peace. When we say transformational education, it should be parallel to the youth's envisioned transformative society. A society where discrimination is eliminated, where all people are entitled to free, equal, accessible, quality education, when a society has the education curriculum that produces an industry that will create millions and equal opportunities, jobs for all, and a society that gives importance to our rights. Using these micro-lenses of how we perceive a transformational society of our future, we can better translate how education financing should be spent that has an emphasis on development and feminism. First, the issue of accessibility is rooted on the very reason that schools are now prone to privatization and state abandonment. And this is a result of liberalization and commercialization of education, as there is an evident state neglect on education as a response to globalization and in adherence to the structural adjustments programs in order to secure loans from the international financial institutions, which is now an international human rights concern. The state is inhibiting their responsibility to finance the education system that results in the exorbitant fees being imposed to the students by the private educational institutions and the recurring budget cut in the education sector. That is why it is necessary to have an automatic appropriation for education pegged at 6% or more of the projected GDP of a country, as this is required by the Delors Commission's global standard for education spending. And this will ensure that the government will sustain the funds to finance the education to remain a public good and a right that must be accessible to all. Also, it is also important to declare a debt relief, especially for the underdeveloped countries, and rechannel the debt service payments to the education service and other social protection services for the people. Second, with the existing digital divide, it is necessary to expand the public education in terms of having additional schools, additional facilities and equipment, allocation of budget for capacity building of program of teachers to bridge the gap on online learning and finance the gadgets needed for adaptation of both the students and the teachers. Third, it is important to invest for the assessment of our existing educational curriculum as it must be developed into a gender-sensitive curriculum and education in order to produce a gender-sensitive classrooms, gender-sensitive schools, and eventually a gender-sensitive society. As I personally believe that this should be developed into a culture within the schools, and only then we can produce a gender-equal society in general. And this could also be addressed by investing on quality assurance systems that will ensure that textbooks will contain gender-sensitive information. Fourth, due to the pandemic-induced consequences on families that has caused declining financial resources among households, the lack of social protection policies and aid among the students should be countered by appropriating a relatively significant amount of financial aid for the stakeholders of the academy. And alongside of this assistance, there must be an accessible and investment on psychosocial services provided by the academic institutions, as the psychosocial distress, especially among students, have caused them to be more academically disengaged and disconnected. And this is the value of having a transformative and feminist lens of education. We empower and enable others to act. And these are just some of the financial investments that must be made on education to comprehensively cover the sectoral concerns of the people around the world and push for the people's budget for education. And now, I urge and encourage the youths of today to have a global task force committee advocating for a free, accessible, quality, transformational, and gender-sensitive education for all, as this will sustain our campaigns, policy proposals, monitor the developments in our educational systems. And I believe that we will lead the youths of today for a great recovery path on education as we bear the lessons and challenges of what we have been confronted in the current education systems that has been further exposed by the global health crisis. As we, the youth, are the critical partners of the state in securing our future. And it is our very duty to create the broadest possible alliance of the youth movement across the globe, because only through militant struggle can the best in the youth emerge. And let us show the power that the youth hold, and together, let us claim our future and reclaim our educational agenda. And on behalf of ASBE and Education Network Philippines, I would really like to thank the GCE for giving us this platform to talk about our policy recommendations and our key engagements and solutions together with the other youths around the world. And this is the only start of our unity. Together, we will emerge victorious not only in our education agenda, but also to all of our youth-led agendas to have a better future and society for all. We are the youth, and this is our power to be the vanguards of change. Thank you very much.
Oh, I love it. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Gave me all the inspiration. I'm going to hand over to my co-moderator, Abidin, to take us through the last bit of this discussion. You are muted, colleague. You are muted with all your excitement. Thank you.
Thank you. Who is as excited as I am for this conversation, from Taiba to Tapiwanache to Leno? They are activating the youth power. They're activating the power of collaboration. It really shows if as young people, we come together, we can really do a whole lot. So I'm going to be moving over to Jobel Hassan and Alexander Sepao. I will be asking them the same question and getting their perspective on it. What are the flaws or gaps in the system when we think about inclusion and equity in education, particularly in emergency contexts? So I want you to share the perspective differently. So I start with Jibril Hassan. What are the flaws or gaps in the system when we think about inclusion and equity in education, particularly in emergency contexts?
Thank you, colleague, and thanks to all attenders. And hi, everyone, and distinguished attendances. On the beginning, let me conduct my response based on situations in Somalia and give you the last stat numbers as a counter in emergence. And Somalia has emerged from years of civil war and complete state collapse, but it continues to face challenges both in terms of humanitarian crisis and as well as enduring conflict, which constrains on the development of the state and its education sector. The effects of conflict and instability in some areas of Somalia are limiting both access and continuity of education. Conflict poses direct threat to education through attacks on school, including killing, abductions, and threats against teachers, as well as destruction and looting of school property. The last stats in January 2021 verified 312 attacks on schools between 2012 and 2019. Outside of the school, students are also often targeted by armed groups, either recruits through sexual violence and abduction, with 1,609 abductions taking place in 2019. And this contributes to a situation whereby children are not safe in school or their way to school, creating further barriers to access. Additional conflict contributes increased humanitarian needs by driving migrations and limiting access to basic necessities. As a result, it is estimated that 1.3 million children in Somalia is needed humanitarian assistance to either stay or enroll in school, so that education system is inevitably linked to the context in which it's functioning. That's why I'm giving you these stats from Somalia, including also cultural and social economic background. These contextual factors are both constraints and enablers to universal access to education, and cannot be ignored the role they play when they are analyzing the equity and inclusion sector more broadly. And every child has the right to be supported by their parents, community, and environment to grow, learn, and develop in the early years, and upon reaching school age to go to school and be welcomed and included by teachers and peers alike when all children are, regardless of their differences, are educated together. However, this is specific, very family and community support is where they miss children in emergency contexts. Added that they are excluded from schools where they belong because of disability, race, language, religion, gender, or poverty. In the conclusion, vital points to mention addressing gaps about inclusion and equity in emergencies can be the first concept of inclusion and equity in education comes from civic involvement and community sectors participation, which Somalia and same-like countries that are in emergency cannot experience. In addition, dismissal of quality education with inclusive systems provide regular times. And moreover, this discriminatory attitudes are rampant in school contexts, which deteriorates the fast relationship agile explorers with the world outside their family and disables the development of their social interaction. Inclusive curricula, parental involvement, and active teaching and learning practices are also in shortage. Thank you, and I will pass the mic to my colleague to add what he would like to add it.
Thank you very much for that. Over to you, Alexandra, for your perspective. Thank you for sharing the perspective from Somalia with us, Jibril. Thank you. So let's hear from you, Alexandra.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I feel really honored to listen to you all, to be here next to you all. And just to mention it, I agree with you all strongly. So I was invited to talk on behalf of my organization, the Organizing Bureau of European School Student Unions, which is as well organized in the Global Students Forum. Instead of starting with the flaws, I really tried to think about good examples. When does inclusion and equity in my environment works? And as always, it was very hard to think about best practices. And I think it only has worked because individuals spoke up, tried to create a better space, a student-owned space. However, this cannot be the only way. This shouldn't be about eager teachers fighting activists. There should be a state-financed public education system that allows school systems to be inclusive and, most importantly, accessible for everyone. I am very sure that we need a system change because over the years we have seen neoliberal cuts everywhere, but who cuts in education or in democratic spaces cuts in our future. I want to make this very clear. When thinking about emergencies, the first thing that comes to my mind out of an European standpoint is the COVID-19 pandemic, where many school students have been left behind. Being forced to be at home, many problems occurred. And we already heard that today. Accessibility to technical equipment, Wi-Fi, missing rooms to learn, accessibility to health, mental health facilities, missing welfare, missing support for teachers, unpaid care work, shrinking democratic spaces, early school leaving. What shocks me most of all is that in some parts of the world, even child labor increased strongly. So problems that were always problems but too often overheard became more obvious than ever. And this crisis for sure has left marks on us all. Not that this crisis is over, but yeah. What angers me most is that in this pandemic, of course, things were done, but what missed, who was overheard, who was forget, was the biggest stakeholder, the biggest mass in the education system, school students, young people. And like, imagine how problem solving could be if people that are affected most are asked first, but I will repeat it until everyone gets it. Nothing about us without us. We ain't fight for some places on some rankings, but for our future. And I agree with the presentation in the beginning, we are more than only human capital. However, COVID-19 is not the only emergency we have in this world. Sadly, we not only have an education crisis, a health crisis, a climate crisis. Sadly, I'm very aware that some peers of mine cannot attend school because there are armed conflicts, because there is war. Peers of mine that are pushed back like 500 kilometers from where I am, Vienna, or drowning in the Mediterranean Sea because human rights in the eyes of too many decision makers in Europe are never as important as the fortress of Europe. School students are even getting deported. So when war is happening, it is the youngest, the most vulnerable that are faced by it first, that is missing out on childhood, out on education. This cannot happen. However, I really know that this is not my position to talk on behalf of other people, though I can quote, nobody's free until everybody's free. And there may be reasons for war, but I can simply not accept that though I lived in peace while the country I'm living in is like exporting guns to the whole of the world. And the perversity of all of this is that there is even a secondary school in Austria where you learn how to build guns, a school where you learn how to build guns. This is like, yeah. So no money for guns, but for an education, please. And to come to an end and to come to the question, inclusion and equity, how can it be reached? As a student activist, and I agree with Eleanor, I believe that we have to stand in solidarity with all young people to fight for access for good quality education. It's on us to organize and shape our world ourselves. And united, internationally, we're stronger and louder. And of course, we have to demand decision makers for money for quality inclusive education, but we cannot wait on them. We have to organize, build spaces and call out, or like it was said in the video in the beginning, hashtag reclaim education. And for me, it always has been important to reflect that school and society are interconnected. Problems in our society are reflected in schools like sexism, racism, homophobia, colonized structures, gaps between rich and poor. So they have to be tackled inside of the classroom as well. I'm in a diverse space, and I believe that we have to be change makers because this world needs change, and education can be this change that we so desperately need. And to close with the words of my friend Carmen that is also here, fundamental rights, and I believe fundamental right is also education, is like, if it's not accessible for everyone, fundamental rights are privileges, and we are not satisfied with those privileges. So thank you very much for the platform, and moreover being here.
Thank you very much. That was very spot on and powerful, Alexander, especially concluding with the fundamental human rights and accessibility of education. Thank you very much. Without further ado, I'm going to be going back to Collins. Collins, thank you for that insightful presentation. So now again, the question says, how can we use research?
Aberdeen,
please move closer to the microphone. Apologies.
Yeah, the interpreters are struggling to hear you, my brother, so bring your mic closer.
Can you hear me clearly now? Awesome. So I was saying I was moving to Collins now. So, and the question is, how can we use research to forward a revolutionary agenda when it comes to the economics of education? Collins. While we wait for Collins. Okay, I guess Collins is having a little bit of network challenge. How about you wanted to conclude the other time, so I'm happy to give you 120 seconds to make your conclusions. I'm so sorry, apologies for cutting you short the other time. Thank you. So Taiba to Zain, if you are there.
Okay, thank you. Let me just say that this has been one of the best conversations I've had in recent time, and it's been so great to be here listening to all the speakers and moderator. I think in addition, I think it is worth mentioning that there is a data of education data to inform policy and finance decision making. And this lack of data has given room for assumptions that could be accurate or flawed. Going forward, I believe there is a need to carry out proper data collection, especially in African countries as it relates to education, to understand on what money should be spent on and where education funds should be going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taibat. We sincerely appreciate you. I absolutely agree with you that data is very, very important. We can't make any informed decision without having data, and for us to, formulate policy, there's a need for us to have data. So I want to know if Collins is there. If Collins is not there, I throw it open for us as participants to ask questions. If there's any question you want to ask any of our panelists, this is an opportunity for you to ask. So please, Collins, when you are here, please let me know. I sincerely apologize on behalf of Collins. I guess you must have been having a little bit of network challenges. So this is the time for questions, and you can use the chat box or raise a question by show of hand. Maybe I throw this open, then I have a question. Like, for participants, COVID-19 has made us see the new normal. How can we bridge the digital divide and issues around gender inequality, especially considering the number of out-of-school children and the number of girls who are out of school? How can the digital divide be bridged, especially in grassroots community? And of course, what can we do about the gender imbalance as far as issues around education is concerned? Any of the panelists who wish to, answer the question, they just unmute and take up the question.
So while people are still trying to decide if they want to take your question, everything there, I just like, Please, people will forgive me. My revolutionary self is. I love how the men are talking about the issues. You know, it's amazing, and it's interesting to hear, because I think one of the mistakes we make, especially when we talk about gender, that these are things that only women and girls must be talking about. Similarly with racism, that race is an issue that only people of color must be talking about. So I'm really excited to hear the engagement. And Taiba, to answer your question about the lack of data, the next section in this agenda is going to try and answer this question. So stay tuned. If there are any other questions people want to ask about panelists, anything you want to contribute before we move on?
Okay, I think I should just briefly address the question posed by Abdeen. And we want to address the issue of the lack of, let's say, the digital divide. I think it is important to address the issue of infrastructure, number one, because it's always a battle of who is able to afford it. And given the current situation, there's a need. I keep saying the government has a lot to do, and they need to come in to bridge this infrastructure gap, to make it data and internet accessible, affordable, and available. That is very important. And to address the question of gender, I think gender is there's been a lot of progress so far, but then there is still so many things to be done. We need to address the socioeconomic constraints. We need to address the pressure to conform to gender roles. We also need to address the institutions and norms, and that is how we can, narrow this gender gap in education. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Taibat. I sincerely appreciate. So without wasting much of our time, I'm going to be going back to my super energetic co-moderator. She's going to be spotlighting the education financing observatory.
Wait, Abidin, sorry. There was a hand. Was it Alexandra? Eleanor, it was you. You had a hand, and then you put it down.
Okay,
yes,
okay.
yes. I would
Please
just like to comment on the question very briefly. First, the issue on the increasing dropout rate, especially among women, is very evident in the Philippines. For instance, in the case of the Philippines, nearly 63% of the young children who dropped out of school in our country were girls. And this should be addressed in a multi-pronged approach, because we need to identify why these women and these girls are forged to stay out of school, and we can address the problem by knowing what is the problem, because there are faceted problems that can trace why women are not being engaged into schools, and this should be addressed when a government has a certain mechanism and strategies in order to create a task force for development on education that has a focus on addressing the widened gender gap, because almost all of the countries have an international treaties for women conventions, but it's not translating really well in the government systems and in the education systems of the different countries. So it has to be a multi-sectoral and whole of government approach, because the government alone cannot bridge the gap on the gender gap on education, and the civil society and the youth organization has the capacity to bridge these gaps among the government systems in order to address the very rooting problem of the educational challenges, not only on gender, but on the financial problems, on the systems management, and among others. That would be all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. That was very, very, very detailed. Still emphasizing on the power of collaboration, which is very, very important. The government cannot do everything alone. There's a need for us to work together to synergize, to really take the ball by the horn and provide lasting solution as young leaders. So thank you. Like I said the other time, of course, I'm going to be passing over the mic to Ashanti. If we do not have any question or anybody raising up their hand, she's going to be spotlighting the education financing observatory. So I implore you to sit back and listen to my co-moderator. Thank you. Over to you, Ashanti.
Thank you so much. If colleagues can just with me while I try to share my screen. Can we all see? Great.
Yes,
so
absolutely, we can see.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about our education financing observatory. In line with our strategic focus areas in education financing and education in emergencies, we are currently in the conceptualization, consultation, and planning phase of establishing a global education financing observatory, which is a structure that aims to do three things. The first is to monitor and track education financing data according to the national budgeting of countries using the 4S framework, which looks at the share of budget going to education, the size of the overall budgets, its sensitivity and scrutiny of education. Collins's presentation earlier illustrates the importance of this, looking at the impact of internal and external debt on national public education systems, the impact of privatization and commercialization of education that dramatically defines us as human capital, and international corporations for education and the role of international development banks, global education funds, bilateral and multilateral corporations for education. The second thing the education financing observatory seeks to do after collecting all of this data is to conduct analyses, right? Specifically from a human rights perspective. And this is what makes the EFO, its idea, so revolutionary. Education financing data is hardly analyzed from a human rights perspective. So we're talking technical, critical, systematically revolutionary analyses of education financing data through a human rights lens that would then allow us to produce thematic reports, studies, articles, blogs, annual publications, promoting the ongoing debate through communities of practice, disseminating our views in such a way that we shift the dominant narratives around education. And then thirdly, using that data and inform our advocacy efforts, right? So serving as critical inputs, evidence-based advocacy actions. Why this is then relevant and important for young people is that inevitably this work will inform education financing decisions made at multiple levels, right? And it cannot be overstated just how critical it is for young people to be in those spaces, and in particular the spaces that decide where the money should go, how it should be spent, and by whom. Yeah, we need to be sitting in those spaces making those decisions. And this is why I strongly encourage you to please engage in this GCE process of creating a global education financing observatory, because if you chop the vision, if we get this right, this can be leveraged as an incredibly powerful tool for young people to not only hold those in power accountable to what they say they're going to do, but to ensure that as young people, we are co-creating future education systems that protect education as a basic human right for all and not compromise it in the name of profit. Co-creating future education systems that do not value us as capital, but value us according to our own development into full human beings. So thus far, we've had consultations with the regional education coalitions, TADE, ASPE, ANTEFA, and ASEA. And the purpose of my contribution here today is to A, make you aware of what is happening, and B, invite you all to please engage us in an official youth consultation about how best to design, structure, and implement this EFO in such a way that youth can take ownership of this process. The follow-up email for this event will contain all the information on the EFO, the concept note, and other learning information on the global financing architecture for education, and as well as a proposed date for more structured and official youth consultation around the EFO that can also answer whatever questions may have come up for you during my presentation now. But for now, we are going to engage by moving on to the ideation session of our agenda today. Abidine, I will kindly hand over to you and ask you to lead us in our final session and help us think about the way forward and what our next steps should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that detailed explanation, Asante, and we sincerely appreciate you. So participants, thank you very much for sparing your time to join this conversation, which is the inaugural conversation. And of course, we have deemed it fit that it won't just be okay alone for us to listen to conversation like this without us as participants not making contributions. So, and that's the reason why we are using the Jamboard. It has been shared by me, and I also noticed that Salma already shared it. Thank you very much for that. We'll be asking key questions on the Jamboard, and of course, the questions will be around how do we see the GCE youth and student constituency leading the recommendations and actions regarding education financing. The second question will be, how do we see youth and student leading, participating in the education financing as well? So I appeal to us to please hover our mouse on that link, click on it to make contribution. The GCE has made it easier for us to be a part of it, because we can never be a part of it without really making contributions. So we believe you're a critical stakeholder as far as this is concerned. And of course, without you, we'll not be able to get results. So thank you. Kindly hover your mouse on the Jamboard while we look forward to reading a whole lot of contributions from you. Thank you. Thank you, Salma, for sharing the screen.
I've also placed the questions in the chat.
Okay, that's gonna be fine. So Salma, please, can you help with the questions on the chat box? So if you need any support or help to access the Jamboard, please kindly use the chat box and let us know. Our technical team are online and be willing to provide any support. The link is on the chat box already, so you can click on it and make contributions. So if we have any challenges with the technicals of accessing the link, please kindly let us know. We look forward to seeing your responses to the questions, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Aberdeen. We've received some notifications from other participants. Salma, if you can please make the Jamboard editable by everyone. So if you can click on the share button, Salma, and make it editable for anyone that has the link. I think people are struggling to gain access. So at the bottom, click change, down, yeah, change, then say anyone, editor, and then say anyone. So go to GCE, Global Campaign for Education. There's an arrow, go down and say anyone with this link. There we go. Say done, and then copy the link and send it in the chat, please. Apologies, everyone. Please, can we all try and access the link now, and feel free to put sticky notes and comments on the Jamboard. This is a space for all of us to co-create and collaborate.
There's a request to have the questions, the translated questions, also put in the chat, please, if possible.
Thank you so much, Ashanti. Salma, is it possible to have the translated questions put in the chat box, or maybe for interpreters to interpret the questions so that participants are able to engage?
Menos mal que se me vino rápido y se paró en la puerta y dijo, buenas.
Okay, the Spanish questions have been placed in the chat box. We are just waiting for the French and Arabic questions. Okay, if I may just demonstrate how to use the Jamboard, just so everyone can see. So you should click on, you'll see on the left-hand side of your screen, there are different options. Please click on this option over here. That is a sticky note. A sticky note will then pop up and you can write whatever you would like. So I'm sending love. And you say save, and then it will come up on the Jamboard. So again, on the left-hand side of the Jamboard, click on the sticky note option, and then you can record your responses on the sticky note. So whatever you would like to comment, whatever you'd like to suggest or recommend, you can type it in here, and then you can press save, and it will appear on your Jamboard. We can also take responses. If people would like to unmute themselves and just speak, that's also okay. If people would like to put their responses in the chat box and not use the Jamboard, that's also okay. Please feel free to use this space as your own space.
Maybe it might be useful to also just speak a little bit about how this would inform the global youth strategy, that process that you're leading on, the inputs for the session as people are ideating.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ashanti. So as we all know, GCE currently has a draft youth and student engagement strategy. All of these conversations will go towards finalizing our strategy. And so your input here, we would like to use as a space and as recommendations for what you would want to see in a GCE youth and student strategy. And so essentially, we are wanting to use today's event, the event on the 21st, and the event on the 28th, to all gather feedback and recommendations and responses from youth and students, and also others working within the space towards SDG 4 and other intersecting goals, to be able for us to really see this in GCE's youth and student engagement strategy. So maybe if I can just read out the first question, and then potentially have people take it, unmute yourself or put it in the chat box. So the first question is, how do we see youth and students leading and participating in the Education Financing Observatory? How do we see that happening? Any takers for feedback? Okay, so another question is, what other strategies and tactics could GCE's youth strategy include when it comes to advocacy, research, and action around education financing? Does anyone maybe want to just, speak into the space and not use the Jamboard? So please feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand or put in your ideas into the chat box. Okay, potentially let's do it this way. Eleanor, I'm sorry to pick on you, but seeing that I'm taking over leading on this. Eleanor, what do you think are some of the strategies that you would like to see in terms of GCE's youth strategy, especially considering the conversations we've had today? What is it that you would like to see in the strategy?
Eleanor there?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was going to suggest, Zina, that it might be also useful if we send these questions as part of the email to ask the survey. Yeah, I don't know how you feel about that. Then we can have give our speakers more time for their concluding remarks as we come up on time.
I think that's a good process and a good idea going forward, Ashanti.
Es Paloma y Marta.
Hi, Aminta.
Sí, recordar que cuando hubo el impasse, la participación de clave.
Aminta, you are muted. Please unmute yourself and you may continue.
I'm trying to. Do you want to unmute yourself? Hi, Marilyn, I see you coming in.
Aminta, Madeleine aquí. Tienes que prender tu micrófono para que puedas hablar.
Yeah, I think we've lost with the internet connection. If there are no other comments, I think I'm going to just invite our speakers to please give us your concluding remarks, and we can wrap up today's session. And Jibril, we can start with you. Thank you.
We'll move to the next person if you're available. I guess maybe network.
I think Aberdeen's audio was a little bit inaudible there. So Ashanti, if we can move to the next speaker, and then I'm busy admitting Aminta again.
That's fine. Taibat, I see you to just use your concluding.
Yes, so I just really want to say that it's been a very insightful conversation, and I want to thank GCE for putting this together. I believe there's been a lot of takeaway, and I can't wait to see the action points that will come out of this in GCE strategy. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much for today. Thank you. Alexandra, can I invite you to give us concluding thoughts?
Sorry, I had a little bit of Wi-Fi issues. I just wanted to say that this panel was very inspiring, and it was a long time ago that I really agreed with everyone, and it was really empowering that we speak up. And I think the most revolutionary thing to do is like to speak what the reality is. And the reality is that education isn't perfect, that we are not doing this for some rankings or for some politicians, but for the sake of young people. So all the students, all the young people of the world unite, I guess. And I hope that I see you soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Jibril, can I invite you for your thoughts?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, and thanks to you all and the facilitators of the panel. So the panel discussion was successful and it was fruitful, and I was very excited to be here today with these active personnel, facilitators, speakers, moderators, and all colleagues. And thanks. I am very excited to look forward with this great team. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Jibril. Can I invite Eleanor to give us your final thoughts, ma'am? Or can't hear me? Can I ask Collins to give us your concluding thoughts? Collins also not there. Tapi Wanashe? Okay, seem to have lost. But Amrita, do you want to maybe finish what you were saying earlier, ma'am? Is she here? Well, otherwise, guys, I'm going to hand over to the moderator because you guys have to conclude with me. I think thank you so much for the time and the engagement and just the sharing of knowledge. And I am so motivated and encouraged by all the work that everyone is doing. We're able to build bridges and co-create alternative realities and futures for us. So thank you so much. You want to close us off, comrade?
Thank you very much. It's quite exciting being here, and we wish you all the best. Keep taking action, keep believing in the youth power, keep believing in the power of collaboration. Africa and the whole world believe so much in you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll have a good rest of the evening, day, morning. Zina, do you want to just stay on the line once everyone's off, yeah?
Sure. Thank you so much, Salma and interpreters. Thank you, Ashanti, for hosting us. Thank you, Carmen.
Yes. Thank you, tech support and everyone. It was really, I think it went okay.
Thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me.
Thank you, Eleanor, for your amazing contribution. Thank you.
We're going to be inviting you much more in future, Eleanor, so please stay tuned for that. Loved your energy.
More than willing to help everyone. Thank you for having me. Next time, until the next time.
Sure, keep well. If everyone can feel free to leave the meeting now, we have concluded. Thank you so much, Andreas.
Hi, Sama, can you end the stream so that it doesn't run empty?